Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to wait another couple minutes to allow folks to trickle in, and then we'll be getting started to talk more about CDFW's State Wildlife Action Plan. So bear with us while we give folks a moment to join. I'm going to go ahead and get started, everyone, and I think folks will continue to join us. Again, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's State Wildlife Action Plan, or SWAP, update information session. My name is Elizabeth Herrera with Kearns and West, and I'll be the facilitator for our session today. And I see some familiar names out in our meeting today, so it's good to see you again. We're joined by Cassidy Shin and Virginia Guin from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They will share more about the State Wildlife Action Plan update and will be available to answer any questions after their presentation. As a note, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the SWAP website at a later date. Just as a side note, I understand that Zoom has been experiencing difficulties today. I personally haven't, and our web manager has not been. But please be patient with us if we experience any Zoom challenges. And if for any reason we're not expecting it, but the meeting freezes or we lose connectivity, please know that we'll restart the meeting and invite you to rejoin. If you're able, please update your name in Zoom. And if willing, include your affiliation, whether you're a public member, government agency, what tribe, or other organization. To do that, you can click on the participants icon at the bottom of your screen. Then when a list of participants pops up, hover over your name and click on the three dots next to your name. Choose Rename, and a pop-up window will appear. That's where you can change your name. On the screen, you'll see a reminder of Zoom features to use during today's session. The Q&A feature is also available for any questions and comments during the presentation. You can find the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. We'll have more on that on the next slide. If you have any technical issues today, please send a message to the web manager, Eunice Lee. You can send her that in chat. She'll be glad to help resolve your issue. And lastly, if you'd like to get a sense of who else is in the meeting today, you can do so by clicking on that participants icon and take a look at who's here today. And I see a lot of folks have renamed themselves. Thank you for doing that. For your awareness, there will be time dedicated for presenters to respond to questions and answers at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A feature or chat throughout today's meeting for any questions or comments you may have. As a reminder, that Q&A pod can be found at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. Now, you can use these throughout today's session, but also know that there will also be an opportunity to ask verbal questions after the presentations. Please be mindful of the time and space for presentations and raise your hands when we open the Q&A. Raised hands will be addressed when we reach Q&A. California Department of Fish and Wildlife staff will do their best to answer all questions from today's session at the end of the presentation. If they can't answer your question today, please reach out to the SWAP team for follow-up via email. And that email address will be available in the chat. And when we do move to Q&A, we'll call on raised hands and give you the opportunity to unmute yourself to ask questions. In order to set the tone for today's meetings, we just have set some engagement guidelines. One, we're just reminding folks to please engage respectfully. Please, we invite you to use the chat or QA to communicate comments or questions to speakers. We're asking folks to share relevant information. We're here to discuss the State Wildlife Action Plan update. So we're asking for comments and questions to be relevant to that work. And just a reminder, we really do want to hear from you and value what you have to share. We hope these guidelines are helpful for our session today. Now, we have a couple polls for you. So you'll soon see a poll appear on your screen. And we're asking that you answer the question and then watch the results come in. Our first question will give us some insight into who is joining us today. So you'll see the poll pop up. Please share your affiliation. We'll just give this a moment for people to respond, and then we will share out the results once we see a good response. Thanks. I see people jumping in on that. All right, I think we've reached critical mass on that. I'm going to end the poll. I'm going to share results. It looks like of our attendees today, 14% from a tribal government. Welcome, we're glad you're here. We have 5% from a federal agency or government. We see 36%, a third of us are from state government agencies, and 9% from private, and 23% from an NGO or nonprofit. And we have 9% community members and 5% say other or one of our attendees. Thanks so much for that information. That actually helps our presenters as they present. And that window may not automatically close. So if you need to, you hit the X at the top right-hand corner of your screen and that'll close. So we have one more poll, just one more, I promise, and then we'll move on to the meat of our presentation. We'd like to understand a little bit how you've used or have you seen the SWAP updates. So if you could just take a moment to answer these questions. I'm just going to give it another 30 seconds or so. Looks like 2/3 of our folks have participated in the poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thank you for participating. I'm going to share those results. It looks like we have an even mix on who's accessed a swap before and who hasn't, 50-50. 50% to 50%, that's incredible. And if folks have used it, we've asked, what have you used it for? We have one person who's used it to write a grant. 8 have learned about or obtained just a general information about the update. And then 36% say they've used it for other means. And then have you reviewed the draft 2025? 2 of the 8 respondents have said yes, they've seen it, and 6 have said no. Well, you still have time because it was just published, made public on the 3rd, so you still have some time to review it. Thank you for that. I'm going to stop sharing. And again, if that screen doesn't close for you, you can just hit the X in the top right-hand corner and it will disappear. Appreciate that. Now that we know who has joined our session and how familiar folks are with the SWAP, I'd like to pass it over to our CDFW partners, Virginia Guin and Cassidy Shin, to share more information. Virginia, it's over to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Elizabeth, and to Eunice behind the scenes, and to the whole Kearns and West team for their continued support in facilitating these sessions. Their team is working diligently behind the scenes, keeping this meeting running smoothly, so thank you. Again, my name is Virginia Guin. I'm a senior environmental scientist specialist with California Department of Fish and Wildlife and a coordinator on the State Wildlife Action Plan. I am part of a small but mighty team within the Department of Fish and Wildlife Science Institute, tasked with the revision of the state's Wildlife Action Plan, or SWAP. On behalf of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, I want to express our appreciation to all of you for spending this time with us today. Before I go over and get into the agenda and other details about the session, I'd like to also acknowledge Cassidy Shin, the SWAP supervisor, whom you will hear from in just a few moments, and Helen Thompson, another SWAP coordinator, who will be answering your questions and helping behind the scenes. I'd like to also take a moment and acknowledge the hundreds of department subject matter experts across the state and across disciplines who have put in many hours to support our work in developing this comprehensive SWAP. California's State Wildlife Action Plan, or SWAP, is a comprehensive, adaptable plan for conserving states' fish and wildlife and their vital natural habitats. It is part of a nationwide effort by all 50 states and 5 U.S. territories to develop conservation action plans and participate in the federally authorized State Wildlife Grant, or SWIG program, which you're going to hear about in just a little bit. Today, we are here not only to share our work on the 2025 SWAP, but to engage with you. We acknowledge the value of all Californians in the process of reviewing and updating the SWAP. Your presence today shines a light on your commitment to protecting California's biodiversity, and we are appreciative of your partnership in this effort. Today's public information session is an opportunity for us to introduce to you California's State Wildlife Action Plan and walk you through the 2025 draft that is now available on our website for comments. Today is also an opportunity for you to ask questions in regards to the SWAP in preparation for your review. The review period, as a reminder, is from March 3rd to March 31st. The draft is online now, along with a comment form. So please follow along with that link in the chat to access. Today, we hope to inspire your involvement in the review process. And this agenda, or our guidance for today, the objectives would be to provide background on and highlights of the SWAP State Wildlife Grant Program, provide opportunities for the public to understand the priorities of the plan, and to understand how the public can contribute to SWAP development, and to give the public an opportunity to ask questions and be heard. So now let's take a look at that agenda. So our agenda today is we will be providing background information on the SWAP by exploring both the history and the purpose of the SWAP, but also the State Wildlife Grant Program. We will spend some time reviewing 2025 SWAP, providing SWAP walkthrough and edits we've made to the SWAP 2015, which was the last revision. We want you to know how you can support the work we are doing, so we will also share how you can participate in the review and comment period, how to access the draft plan and the comment form, and the timeline associated for submitting those comments. We will end our time together with a facilitated question and comment session. All right, so next slide. Before we dive right into the history of SWAP and the rest of the details, we feel it's important to highlight the why. Why have a state wildlife action plan? California is home to an astonishing array of biodiversity. It boasts more native species than any other state in the United States and contains the highest number of endemic species, those found nowhere else on Earth. The state's wildlife includes 100 species of reptiles, 75 species of amphibians, 650 species of birds, and 220 species of mammals. With 6,500 plant species, subspecies, and varieties, California represents roughly 32% of all vascular plants in the United States. As one of 36 global biodiversity hotspots, California's exceptional variety of life is matched by the urgent need to protect its unique habitats and wildlife. This biodiversity is a result of the state's diverse topography and climate, which have fostered a wide range of habitats and an equally diverse array of plants and animals. Remarkably, within just 80 miles of each other, you can find the highest and lowest points in the contiguous United States. Mount Whitney towering over 14,000 feet, and Death Valley sinking to 282 feet below sea level. If we care about maintaining this biodiversity, then we need to be proactive and have a plan. And that brings us to the why we're here today to talk about California's State Wildlife Action Plan. I'd like to now hand it over to Cassidy Shin to provide you with the background and details of SWAP 2025. It's all yours, Cassidy.
Thank you, Virginia.
Mhm.
I'm Cassidy Shin, and I'm a supervisor within the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, overseeing the SWAP review and update. So I'm going to start by briefly sharing the history and purpose of SWAP and what the state wildlife grant programs are. Congress created the State Wildlife Grants Program in 2000, recognizing the need to fund programs for the conservation of wildlife diversity. Congress mandated each state and territory to develop a SWAP by 2005 and that it provide a comprehensive wildlife conservation strategy. An approved SWAP enables states and territories to continue to receive federal funds through the State Wildlife Grant Program. So California's first SWAP was completed by the then California Department of Fish and Game, and it was approved by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service requires SWAPs to be updated at least every 10 years. So CDFW completed its first major update to SWAP in 2015. Now, here we are 10 years later, and CDFW is updating the SWAP for 2025. And that's what we're going to focus on and highlight today. So CDFW uses the state wildlife grant funds to develop and implement the State Wildlife Action Plan, SWAP, and has received $71 million in federal support for conservation, for wildlife conservation since 2005. That's about $2 to $3 million a year. Projects must connect to or implement SWAP, whether it's to benefit a species or implement a SWAP goal, conservation target, or conservation strategy. Now we'll briefly describe those more in detail. So CDFW's State Wildlife Grant website, I believe it's already been posted into the chat, and you're invited to go there and learn more. There's also what's called a competitive state wildlife grant program, and proposals must involve multiple states with a designated lead entity from one of those participating states. Tribes, other agencies, and conservation partners are eligible to partner with lead state agencies and apply for these grants. This program is competitive nationally, and CDFW does not post a public notice for this program, so applicants submit proposals directly to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Their website, where you can get more information, will also be dropped into the chat. So to summarize, SWAPs at their basic function are a mechanism by which states and their partners are eligible for federal funding for conservation. They are and can be much more than that, though. SWAP documents the health of California's fish, wildlife, and plant resources. It recommends conservation strategies and actions. It addresses the needs of species of greatest conservation need, and it balances conservation needs with the needs of California's large and diverse population. Next slide, please. Okay, so SWAP 2015 was a major plan update, and it took many years to complete. For the SWAP 2025 update, CDFW is maintaining much of the same structure and content, but it's been completely reviewed and updated. CDFW's goals for the SWAP 2025 update include review all the content, update where needed. 2, incorporate new science and data, including for climate change throughout. 3, reduce redundancy and improve usability. 4, make it accessible. And 5, create a new SWAP website. We had over 200 CDFW subject matter experts review and edit the plan over the last year. One glaring gap that we found in the SWAP 2015 was tribal partnership, engagement, collaboration. And so both the SWAP team and the CDFW tribal liaison have made a concerted effort to bolster the plan with new information and to highlight the importance of tribes in conserving our shared natural resources. A new addition to the plan is an appendix on wildlife connectivity. We've also converted the plan into an accessible document. So for those of you that have accessed the 2005 or the 2015 you're going to notice some changes in terms of like table layouts, colors, all in the effort to make it an accessible document for all Californians. Finally, although the draft SWAP 2025 is shared on our website in a PDF, we are moving away from a static file, and instead we will unveil a new SWAP website when we publish the final SWAP 2025. So, we've done a lot of work over the last year, and here we are now sharing the public draft, and we're seeking review from our tribal partners, other agencies and organizations, and the public. So for some of you that have used the previous version, that might look and feel familiar, or for some of you, the information we're sharing today, and when you go into the plan, it's all going to be completely brand new. I'm going to highlight some important priorities of SWAP in specific chapters in the following slides. Next slide, please. So California's SWAP uses an ecosystem approach to conserve and manage habitats and species, and it lists actions necessary to conserve California's natural resources. Its implementation relies on making conservation information more accessible to resource managers and the public, and on developing lasting partnerships with a broad array of governments, agencies, organizations, and businesses. I want to briefly describe SWAP priorities, as that provides the framework for the plan. I'm going to keep these all fairly high level for the sake of time, but I will note which chapters these priorities are listed or described should you want to dive into any of these. So first, I'll touch on statewide goals. Next slide. There are 3 statewide goals in SWAP intended to enhance California's ecosystems. They're posted here. CDF retained the same goals from 2015. So they include increasing species abundance and richness and enhancing ecosystem conditions, functions, and processes. These overarching goals represent the desired ecological outcomes of SWAP implementation. So for each of these goals, there's 4 sub-goals. They're not listed here on the slide, but if you'd like to read them, they are in chapter 4. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to highlight pressures and stressors. Next slide. So CDFW broadly describes the biodiversity that exists within the state, and it also identifies stresses and pressures that impact this biodiversity. So a stress is a degraded condition of an ecological species, community, or ecosystem. Understanding the ecological stresses experienced by California's wildlife and ecosystems is critical to identify the conservation strategies needed to counteract them. And a pressure is an activity that influences a stress and could significantly change the ecological conditions of a community. In SWAP 2025, we described 29 unique pressures. Examples of pressures include wildfire, renewable energy, and dams and water management, as pictured here, but also invasive species, recreational activities, plus housing and urban development. So those are just a few examples. CDFW focused on bolstering information regarding emerging or expanded pressures since 2015. This included new information on fire suppression and resiliency, renewable energy projects, cannabis cultivation, and emerging invasive species. So this information was expanded upon in Chapter 2 in the provincial chapters, which are chapters 5.1 through 5.7 and Appendix E. Next slide. Okay, so next, CDFW identified conservation targets. And before describing those, I'm going to briefly describe the spatial scales that are represented in SWAP and their relationship to one another, as that provides context for the conservation targets. Next slide. So I'm going to walk you through the SWAP spatial scales. This is a really busy figure, and I'm not going to get into all the weeds of the details, and I recognize it might even be a bit challenging to read on the slide. But I do want to point it out, and I recommend reading about the SWAP spatial scales to better understand how CDFW developed conservation targets and conservation strategies. So I will point you to chapter 1, where they are described in more detail, including this figure. At the very top, the provincial scale is the broadest scale, and there are 6 terrestrial and freshwater aquatic provinces in SWAP. They're grouped under chapters 5.1 through 5.6, and 1 province chapter, 5.7. And I'll highlight those on the next slide. Additionally, there are separate chapters for anadromous fish and for offshore islands. And then we kind of funnel our way down to conservation targets. So I'm skipping towards the bottom of the figure here. And CDFW identified conservation targets for SWAP. And conservation targets can be a natural community. So think vernal pools as an example, an aquatic species assemblage, like the Walker River native fish assemblage. And in the marine environment, an example is the intertidal zone. So CDFW performed a conservation target prioritization process in 2015. And we kept those same conservation targets, and we added a handful of new ones for 2025. So we have over 80 conservation targets listed in the plan. On the next slide, I'll discuss where those targets live within the SWAP. And finally, conservation strategies were developed for the 80+ conservation targets. So with the intention of benefiting both habitat and the species of greatest conservation need, which I'll discuss soon. Next slide. Okay, SWAP conservation targets are listed within 7 major geographic provinces. And that's what's depicted on this map. The 7 provinces include the North Coast and Klamath, Cascades and Modoc Plateau, Central Valley and Sierra Nevada, Bay Delta and Central Coast, South Coast, Deserts, and Marine. There's a chapter for each province, as I mentioned on the last slide. Based upon your location, jurisdiction, or expertise or interest, you may want to focus your review on one or a couple of the SWAP province chapters. This map is found in chapter 5.0. It can help you orient yourself in the SWAP universe. SWAP province chapters, as I mentioned, but will reiterate, are 5.1 through 5.7. And this is where the conservation targets and the conservation strategies live. They're found within the province chapters. So if you'd like to see the meat of this action plan, that's where you'll want to focus. And so for each province chapter, CDFW reviewed and updated existing pressures and added new pressures. It reviewed and updated climate change sections with the latest projections and information, and ensured that information is accurate and up to date. Next slide, please. Okay, SWAP prioritized conservation strategies to address identified pressures and stressors. So the 12 categories of conservation, there are 12 categories of conservation strategies. So examples of a conservation strategy include data collection and analysis, outreach and education, land use planning, and partner engagement. These are all described in detail in chapter 4. For each conservation target, we created a set of conservation strategies to improve conditions of the target. I'll walk you through an example of a conservation strategy next. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to walk us through an example. Coastal dune and bluff scrub is a new conservation target for 2025 within the South Coast province. This is one of the many conservation strategies listed for this target. So for each strategy, there's an objective, the pressure this strategy is targeting, and specific actions. So the conservation strategy category here is land acquisition, easement, and lease. The strategy is to protect priority habitats through acquisition, permanent conservation easement, or other means, and purchase land in a corridor connecting 2 protected areas to provide connectivity of habitat. The objective is to increase total acreage of conserved coastal dune and bluff scrub, prioritizing those areas that are resilient to sea level rise and/or increase available area for retreat of existing dune or bluff habitats. Now, the targeted pressures this strategy is trying to alleviate is housing in urban areas, roads and railroads, and climate change. A specific conservation action that can be taken is to purchase lands or secure easements from willing sellers through grants and other funding sources. So as you can imagine, if there are more than 80 conservation targets and each target has at least one strategy, well, there's over 250 strategies captured in the SWAP 2025. Now, given the size and diversity of California, we simply cannot capture every single target or strategy, and we acknowledge there are gaps. CDFW reviewed and updated the strategies for 2025, and many of the strategies were retained from 2015. Next slide, please. Okay, last but not least, a key element of SWAP is identifying the species that have the greatest need for conservation, otherwise known as species of greatest conservation need, or SGCN. Next slide, please. So SWAPs must identify species of greatest conservation need. For SWAP 2025, CDFW subject matter experts reviewed the SWAP 2015 selection criteria, updated the criteria, and then evaluated species for inclusion. This process resulted in a list of almost 1,400 species of invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, fish, birds, mammals, plants, and algae. So criterion 1 includes species that are listed as threatened, endangered, or candidate species in California under the Federal Endangered Species Act or the California Endangered Species Act, and some current candidates for listing were included as well. Criterion 2 includes species for which there is a conservation concern. The species under the second criterion are identified as either having the California Species of Special Concern or Fully Protected designation. And now the Species of Special Concern designation doesn't carry any formal legal protection. The intent of that designation is to focus attention on animals of conservation risk, stimulate research on poorly known species, and achieve conservation and recovery of these animals before they meet criteria for listing as either threatened or endangered. Now, criterion 3 for inclusion is for species that were identified by CDFW as being highly vulnerable to climate change, experiencing population decline, and/or highly vulnerable to other stressors. Examples include from pesticides, disease, or habitat loss. This information was based upon expert opinion and/or is documented in published literature or reports. If you'd like to read the criterion for selection, it is described in detail in Chapter 2. I want to note here that per the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, currently plants and algae are not eligible for state wildlife grant funding, but CDFW thinks they're important to include, and they benefit from the conservation strategies. So should the ability to fund plant and algae-related grant proposals become available in the future, California will be ready to go. Ultimately, the SWAP conservation strategies will benefit both conservation targets and the SGCN. We welcome input on the criterion and the draft SGCN list. The SGCN list is in Appendix C. Okay, next slide. This figure is a very simple representation of moving from a degraded habitat towards one of improved ecosystem conditions through the implementation of SWAP strategies. So ultimately, the benefit of implementing SWAP, specifically implementing the SWAP conservation strategies, is to improve the condition of conservation targets and SGCN. In doing so, we strive to maintain and increase ecosystem and native species distributions while sustaining and enhancing species abundance and richness. Next slide. Okay, so these are the draft SWAP 2025 chapters. I've highlighted changes and called out specific chapters and throughout the presentation, but there are some additional edits I want to highlight for the draft. especially for those of you that have accessed or used the 2015. So CDFW revised content to be more concise and allow the reader to access the most updated information. So that means you'll see a lot more web links. We removed outdated, incorrect, and redundant information based upon the latest science and reports. We reviewed and updated all the images, maps, tables, and figures. We added new story highlights on species and conservation projects. We added new lists of CDFW monitoring plans, management plans, or grant reports with monitoring components, and we expanded information on monitoring. We also reviewed and updated all existing references and added new references and added more and new information on CDFW programs. Next slide. And this is a list of the draft SWAP 2025 appendices. I already mentioned that there was a new appendix on wildlife connectivity, and now we also have a dedicated appendix for relevant regulations, CDFW programs, and CDFW grant programs. Next slide. I want to note that integration and implementation are two of the most important aspects of SWAP. Implementation of California's SWAP 2025 will involve integrating SWAP priorities into other resource management programs and plans led by our partners, including tribes. CDFW determined that a more detailed coordination framework for SWAP implementation was needed and created what are called companion plans, which are sector-specific action plans, and this was in 2015. Each companion plan is intended to be standalone, but they reference back to or they use similar terminology of the SWAP. Each companion plan lists prioritized pressures and strategies, identifies collaboration opportunities, provides potential funding sources to implement the shared priorities, and it describes desired outcomes from collaboration. A total of 9 companion plans were developed in 2015. Now, due to CDFW staff capacity and our tight review timeline, the tribal lands and the water management companion plans were the only plans that we have reviewed and updated for 2025. Most of the content remained the same for these 2 plans. We've just ensured that the information was still accurate. We know that we have gaps in our knowledge though, and we are asking the public to review and comment on these 2 companion plans in addition to SWAP 2025. Next slide, please. We're excited to announce that we're moving the SWAP away from a static PDF and into its very own webpage. Pictured here are SWAP websites from our neighboring states, Oregon and Arizona, whom both have transitioned their SWAPs into a web-based format. There's a national movement for state SWAPs to go web-based. We believe a website will make SWAP more accessible, interactive, user-friendly, and engaging. It'll enable us to better display SWAP data, and it'll allow users to more seamlessly connect between SWAP and other CDFW online tools and databases. The content that you'll be reviewing in the draft SWAP 2025, which is available now online, that's the content that you'll see in the new SWAP website. So I'm going to hand it back over to Virginia now. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassidy. Thank you so much for that thorough overview of the draft 2025, the review process, and just a foundational overview of SWAP 2025 and the work we've been doing. I'd like to quickly turn to the outreach and engagement around SWAP and the update efforts over the last year. So in 2024, we announced that CDFW had initiated this update process and posted online an online form soliciting feedback on the use of SWAP 2015. If you completed that form, we thank you. In February, we updated the SWAP website to announce the impending release of the draft SWAP and these public meetings. We also shared the release of the draft SWAP on March 3rd and invited the public to participate in the review via CDFW's social media posting. This is the second of 2 public information sessions. I noticed that we have a number of conservation partners in the session today. So I wanted to highlight that we will also have 4 partner information sessions scheduled for next week. So these sessions will be slightly different presentations, a little bit more focused on conservation partners and engagement with partners around SWAP. So if you're interested and you'd like to sign up, or you'd like to forward that registration link to someone, we're going to drop that registration into the chat. You can also go onto the SWAP website and you can see the schedule of when those dates and times are for the 4 partner sessions that we're hosting next week. I want to reiterate that the draft SWAP was posted on our website on March 3rd and is now available to review. We will conclude the review period on Monday, March 31st, and I'm going to get into more details on that in the upcoming slide. And as a reminder, we must submit our final plan to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service no later than October 1st, 2025. So it seems like a long time away, but it's coming really quickly, and we've got a lot of work to do. At that time, we will be ready to unveil our new SWAP website once there's approval, and we will announce when it goes live. So please stay tuned to that new update. Finally, how can you participate in the review process? And once again, we have posted the draft online between March 3rd through March 31st. We've also posted an online comment form to make your responses easy. And this is now accessible. And we're going to recommend that submitting comments via the form as the best way for us to be able to access and coordinate comments and suggestions and be responsive. We are happy to also accept comments that are emailed or mailed in. You'll see our website shared in the chat at this time, along with our email and mailing address. Any comments you share during today's meeting are also being recorded, and those will be captured as well. SWAP team, the CDFW subject matter experts across the state will be reviewing all submitted comments through these various channels. We plan to incorporate as many suggestions as possible, given our tight update timeline and those that align with the identified priorities. We may follow up with you to get clarification on a submitted suggestion or comment, but we will not be responding directly to all submitted comments though. As guidance, while we welcome you to review any and all of the draft SWAP 2025, we encourage you to review the SWAP provincial chapters that most align with your location and your jurisdiction, and the chapters that align with your areas of interest and expertise. We want to also note that we will be moving towards an annual update process, and comments submitted after the March 31st deadline may not be incorporated into the 2025 plan, but we will be capturing and considering those for future annual updates. We don't want to discourage anyone from submitting. So if you're unable to make the timeline within this time frame, we still welcome all your suggestions. At this time, I'm going to hand it back over to our facilitator with Kearns and West, Elizabeth, for facilitating our question and answer session. I'm going to remind everyone, as she is as well, that we're going to welcome your comments in both the question and answer section and in the chat box. We'll be going over those. And then there'll be an opportunity to raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask your questions directly of the SWAP team. So again, thank you so much for being with us today. And Elizabeth, it's all you.
Well, it looks like we might be at the end of our questions, Cassidy, so I will turn the mic back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so this is our SWAP website and our SWAP email. So the quickest way to reach our team is to submit an email, an email or a question to the SWAP inbox. So swap@wildlife.ca.gov. And this is our contact information for the SWAP team. And just want to remind people that if you are planning to review and comment on the draft, you can access the information on how to provide comment on our website. including access to an online comment form. That is our preferred method of submitting comments, but you can also send us an email or snail mail. And we recommend that you go to our website and check back in. As shared, the final plan will be available in October, unveiling our new website. That's the goal. And you can sign up to stay informed. There's a SWAP email sign up on our website, so I encourage you to sign up. Otherwise, really appreciative of you taking your time today to participate in this informational session, learn about the draft, and any time that you can commit to reviewing, commenting, we greatly appreciate it. We really value your input. Otherwise, our team is happy to stay on for another 30 minutes if a question just came to mind or you were feeling shy. So we'll stay on if there are any questions. Otherwise, thank you again and have a nice rest of your day.
Thanks all. Take care.